Hey, thanks for joining me in this devlog. In the last 2 years, I have been developing my RPG game where you take back Orc Camps in creative ways. In the last month, I noticed how boring the game was, so I decided to remake my entire game in a single month. If you too want to make your own game in a month and win big prizes, I'm happy to say that this video is sponsored by COROL. They are currently hosting their invitational game jam with $140,000 in prizes and a chance to win your very own Tesla Model 3, like literally the car. Only 50 creator applications will be accepted, so go ahead and submit your portfolio today. And if you're unsure what COROL is, then you're probably living under a rock. COROL is a free game creation platform that allows you to create and publish your very own games with little to no coding experience. They provide you with thousands of high quality music, sound, and art assets, so your first game could rival some of the best games out in today's market. But if you're just a coding Chad, then COROL allows you to create your own game logic using Lua, giving you the ability to push your game to the next level. If you're not in the mood to make your own game, COROL also allows you to play over 20,000 games made by the people from the community. And even better, COROL just announced that they are doing a 50% revenue share with all of their creators. So be sure to go down in the description below and check out COROL. It's completely free and you guys will not regret it. The first thing on my to-do list was making the exploration a lot more interesting. I began with changing up the walk and the run animations because they always felt really awkward and you guys just loved telling me that. With that small change, moving around felt so much better. After that, I realized that swimming was even worse. In order to make sure future me didn't have an aneurysm, I spent a lot of the time making sure that the swimming logic flowed well. But I soon realized how boring that was and I switched my focus onto adding in some polish to the player. This idea was originally inspired by a teammate. In his own project, he managed to get the player's head to move in the direction the camera was facing, and just like in the glorious motherland, I had to yoink that. Since Dennis used Final IK to implement this, I had to do it a bit differently than how he did it. What I ended up doing was getting the camera's and the player's current forward direction, and I used this information to take the cross product between those two vectors. Finally, I outputted this value into the animator, which would take that information and would interpolate between a looking left, forward, and right animation I already had set up. And it worked. With the basic movement done, I moved on to making the combat feel much better. But before I hopped right into adding random stuff, I took a minute and sat back to think about what makes combat fun and come up with a few changes. I wanted there to be a noticeable hit visual effects so that the player knows he made contact. Furthering the idea of giving the player some more feedback, I wanted the critical hits to seem more impactful. So I wanted there to be some sort of screen shake and a slowing of time effect for a short duration. Lastly, I noticed how unimpactful the sword swing was, and many of you guys have mentioned it in the comments before, so I think it's time to give that a bit of a refresh. But before getting that all in, there has been a feature that I have been dying to get in, so I think it's time to implement it. For the longest time, I wanted to visually show which weapons the player has equipped on his body, but I never had time to step back and get this in. Honestly, it was quite a roller coaster of emotions because there are so many edge cases to handle, but after about a week of crying in a corner, I finally managed to fix all the bugs and get it to work properly. I hope. Rewinding back to the combat improvements, I started tackling that to-do list. As of now, there wasn't much of a visual indicator that you hit something, so that's what I started working on first. I'm not the best when it comes to visual effects, and since it's always something I wanted to improve upon, I thought this was a perfect opportunity to do so. I ended up with something like this. It wasn't too difficult with just a few basic shapes and a large circle, but it gives the player that feedback that I wanted it to. With that crossed off the list, it's time to move on to the critical hit. The first thing I did was change the hit effect to a darker red color to give the player some extra feedback. After changing that, it was time for the slow motion effect. This was quite simple since all I did was change the time.timescale for a certain number of frames and then just reset it back to 1. Honestly, I was quite surprised with how these simple changes already gave the player so much more feedback and a much larger reward for hitting the target. But we're not done just yet. The final thing I added was a slight screen shake to the camera whenever the player got a critical. The way I went about adding it was quite easy. Since I'm already using Cinemachine for my camera, they have a super simple feature to add noise so you can give your camera a handheld effect or an explosion shake quite easily. Now it's time to tackle probably the biggest problem I have, which is improving the weapon swings. At a glance, the animations look fine, but seeing and playing is a whole different story. The animations I'm using for the player are much more realistic than I like, and that mixed with our more stylized low poly look made the two clash. So I had either two options: try and merge these two very different styles or find new animations that fit better. And since the latter was easier, you already know what I went with. By simply switching out the slash, it already looks so much better. This was even without all the effects like the trail behind the sword. Speaking about those effects, I implemented them all the way back before I even started this YouTube channel, so I think it's time to update them. After about a day of tinkering and thinking about how to make the slash effect look like it was cutting through the air, I came up with something like this. I added a distortion effect onto the slash and made the particles much more clear. These changes were quite minor, but I think it had a huge impact on how powerful the slash looked, and at this point I felt ready to work on the movement again. The swimming has a few key components. First off, it has the player landing in the water. I turned off the gravity and the control the animations had to move the player. This was because I wasn't using the animations to determine how the player moved, but rather the physics. I did this by changing the player's velocity using a constant force when the forward key was pressed. I also wanted the player to be able to swim upwards and downwards by just looking more up or down. This final addition took a bit more work since I had to add more functionality between the camera and the player's rotation. Now you might have noticed one crucial thing missing from the movement. I have redone the entire movement system from the water to the land, but what about jumping? Instead of jumping right into it, I decided to do something more professional and really think about what jumping offers in my game. Jumping in most games have a carved out purpose, while in my game it always felt like an afterthought. This is why I've decided to completely remove the mechanic from my game, as it doesn't really serve a purpose other than just being there. Instead of having a jump mechanic, I decided to have the spacebar binded to a roll. This is used in many Souls-like games in order to give the player an easier time dodging different enemy attacks, and seemed to be a better fit in my game rather than jumping. Let me know what you guys think of this change in the comments down below. The final thing I did this month was getting the enemies up to speed with all the new changes. I implemented the new equipment system to the orcs so that they can put away their weapons whenever they don't have a target. One of the biggest changes was that I also switched up their attack animation so they also match the style of the game. With such a simple change, the enemies actually felt like a real threat to the player. And I know many of you may have been hoping that reworking the game meant adding in multiplayer or other cool features, but the problem is that networking in Unity is a whole beast that just seems a bit too much to handle at this current moment. But that is what I love about Core. Core allows you to easily implement multiplayer with just a few clicks, and even better, Core is completely free. Just visit coregames.com or click in the link in the description below. Now if you want to see how I made a game in 48 hours, check out this video right here.